So I'm going to jump straight into the first piece. And there's something about it that's got a kind of links back to when Andy and I first knew each other. So every so often you read a book or you come across something in life that has a real material impact and changes you for the better. And many moons ago, you've got to think that Andy and I, when we first met, and it was 20 years ago, and we probably, if you'd met us at the time, probably found us in the pub more often than we probably weren't in the pub. And you probably would have seen us drinking and smoking quite heavily and enjoying ourselves and having fun. And one of the things, as time goes on, you grow up and you start to think that you don't want to do these things anymore. And don't forget, these were the days when you could smoke in pubs, and you decide you're going to give up smoking.
And this was pre-relationships, pre-children. We had nothing better to do, effectively, after work, and the pub was right next door. And it was convenience. And obviously, we like to sort of catch up over the football.
Yeah, so it's like those good old days. Some people refer to them as, and it was a period after which you grow up, and then we decided that obviously you want to give up smoking because it's bad for you. And at the time, I tried different ways, just pure willpower. I didn't do patches or anything like that, but I can't remember how I came across something called Alan Carr's The Easyway. And it's in reference to a book that you read to help you give up smoking. And when I say Alan Carr, it's not the comedian, it's spelt differently. It's Allen and Carr Carr. Now, the book was in some ways life-changing, because by reading this very short book and smoking while you read the book, by the end of it, you will have given up smoking. Now, it doesn't work for everybody, but given that it worked for me and it worked for you, didn't it, Andy?
It did, yeah, absolutely.
And by reading the book, it effectively uses an element of psychology and reverse brainwashing in a way to help you overcome addictions. And the reason it's relevant for this podcast is because Andy's been reading another book from the same author in relation to sleep.
Yeah, that's right. And not that I have a problem with sleeping, but I was in the bookshop anyway. We were actually at a book signing, and they're very clever the way they do it. They snaked you round the bookstore, and it was in the corner there, sort of shouting at me, and it was Alan Carr's Easyway to Better Sleep. And while I don't have trouble sleeping, I probably don't sleep enough. I don't prioritise my sleep. And I thought, do you know what? I could probably read that and get something from it. So I bought it, started reading it, and there were so many similarities to the smoking book, the psychology, and just common sense. And I love the book. And actually, since reading that, I've gone an extra 2 or 3 hours a night, extra sleep, and it's pretty good stuff.
So we were talking about this in the office, and I said I didn't realise that they'd done other books. I thought it was really just around the sort of smoking and drinking. There's another one that they do, and some other addictions. And we then started chatting, and there is actually one around debt. So it's how to get out of debt. And the book is a book, the original one on smoking, is a book that I recommend to lots of people. So there aren't many books that you come across in life that you really do think have a material impact and change your life in a certain way. But this was a book for me where I was able to give up smoking, and Andy said he's used it as well. And the idea that they had one for debt, I found incredibly intriguing, therefore. So what I've done is I've read the book, and we're going to do a piece on the podcast which is going to just sort of explain what the book talks about, because it's a different way at looking at the debt problem. So there'll be people here listening to this podcast who may have debt, they want to pay it off, and rather than berate you about you should know better, it's the same as smoking, telling somebody that they shouldn't be smoking. They know that it doesn't work for everybody, they won't necessarily give up. Let's be honest, cigarettes are hidden behind counters that you can't see, and they now have pictures of diseased lungs and things like that on it. If it was pure fact that would drive people to give up smoking, there wouldn't be smokers. It just shows that it doesn't work for everybody. So sometimes just telling people how to get out of debt is not enough. It's not going to be for everybody. So to give you a one example where you can do things differently, and it's about psychology. If you recall, we talked about clearing debt in the past before you invest. So you have the stages to become financially independent, and we'll put a link in the podcast actually to a past episode that was incredibly popular. We talked about it, and there are different ways of doing it. That you need to get rid of debt before you start building up emergency funds is one method, or start investing. And there was a guy called Dave Ramsey in America who is a kind of a financial guru. Well, he's a bit like us, to be honest. He's got a podcast, everything like that. And one of the methods that he has about becoming effectively financially independent, he says you should have a £1,000 buffer put in place before you clear your debts, because it breaks the cycle of using debt. And the idea being that, therefore, if your car tyre blows up and you need to repair that, you're not relying on a credit card, you've got the money to spend on that tyre, then you can fill that fund back up as you get the money from your next pay packet, avoiding running up any more debts. And that way you do break that cycle. But Alan Carr's book takes a completely different view, because with his book and his way of helping people to get rid of debt and overcome that is to actually break the psychology of it and why you do it. Why do you have debt? Why do you spend lots of money or more money than you have? Just by having £1,000 buffer, it might break the cycle of why you're immediately spending. But if fundamentally you are somebody who's going to keep spending all of the time, there's a deeper rooted problem. So the books tend to, whatever the addiction, they tend to work by following a set methodology. And one of the parts of that methodology is that you shouldn't question what you're reading, you just read it with an open mind. And you've read them, Andy, and they're quite hypnotic in the way they're written.
Yeah, that's right. And to be honest, that is the fundamental part of the book. That is how it works. It works by repeating the same message, asking you to be open-minded, and then slowly but surely it helps to, it's like an onion, it peels away the layers. It starts to break down the things that were causing the problem in the first place, and it starts to make sense. And if it only did it once or twice, or only covered the same things once or twice, I don't think the message quite gets through. It's the fact that it keeps going on that same theme and message that eventually you get it.
Yeah, and so in the debt world, the way the book works and the process, because it's all about psychology, and don't forget, with the addictions, they have different, lots of different centres around the world where people could go and get help with different addictions. And what they do is allow you to understand that spending in a way that you do it when you accrue lots of debt is effectively an addiction. You have an addiction to spending money. And so he calls it junk spending. And the initial chapters of the book look at the misconceptions around debt and spending. It emphasises that overspending is an addiction fueled by an illusion that spending brings pleasure, an idea that's perpetrated by like large retail companies. So you've got to think, when you look at the TV, you have adverts, magazines, whatever, there are products being pushed at you that are associating certain things. They're using an element of brainwashing to associate ideas of pleasure with their product. So the product fundamentally may not be a product that's a positive to you. So they even give examples in the book, things like chocolate bars. So it may be that they're the idea of the chocolate bar that they present on a TV advert has all sorts of other things about relaxation, people in bars. It has this scene. It sells you an ideal that you therefore want to be associated with. But fundamentally, a chocolate bar is something that's high in sugar and very bad for you. So if they just told you what the product did, you wouldn't buy it. What you're actually selling is not the product, they're selling an idea. And you think back about cigarette adverts, alcohol adverts, they don't necessarily sell you the product, they're selling you this ideal. And so what you're doing is you're getting brainwashed about the things that you don't need, so you go and buy them. So it's a bit like that phrase, you buy things you don't need to almost ultimately impress people you don't even like. So the process works by showing you this brainwashing, and it kind of reverse brainwashes you. So it starts to show that this is what is happening to you. This is why you spend lots of money on junk spending, buying things that you don't want. The problem is actually your belief that you will feel better by buying something. And there's some really good examples in the book that they give. So there's examples in the book of an idea of, say, a father has a child, and the child just wants their dad to play with them, but the dad is busy. And what the dad does, because he feels guilty about that, he therefore goes out and buys a toy for his child. And the child therefore is momentarily happy with that toy, but eventually throws it against the wall, throws a tantrum, breaks it, because all the child really fundamentally wants is attention and love. But the dad then sees that, gets angry, there's a big blow up, and he feels guilty. So what he does is he goes out and buys another better toy, and the child therefore likes that toy, feels positive for a moment in time, and it goes on and on and on, and you get into this cycle. But fundamentally, what's happening is the dad is spending money because he thinks the spending is going to ultimately produce some sort of pleasure and solve problems. But really, the problem is the relationship with his child and the fact that he's working, and what he really should be doing is thinking about the things that are free in life. And so he ends up having a spending addiction effectively by doing something repetitively because he believes it's going to be make his life better.
And that element of associating pleasure and then actually finding out through a process of reading this book and understanding problem is kind of where the book sits. Because I remember a very key part of when I did the smoking book, it used very clever analogies. And one analogy which I really liked, because essentially with cigarettes, you associate that with pleasure, but we all, of course, know smoking is not good for you. So I remember the book telling you about thinking about say like an ex-girlfriend or an ex-partner. When you think about them now, you associate them with something quite negative in your mind, potentially because they're an ex and you've moved on and you're happy in your life. And but actually at one point in your life, that same person you would have had positive emotions for. So what you've done very easily in your brain is you've swapped out the emotion of pleasure and displeasure. It's the same person. The person hasn't changed, but your brain is able to very easily switch one emotion to another, but it's the same person. So if you do that, and a cigarette is exactly the same thing. If you're able to properly give up smoking and understand why you don't like the cigarettes anymore, you're able to swap that association of pleasure with an association of like hatred or whatever. And that's a very clever process that it does.
Yeah, and one of the things like, because again, the spending part, you read the book and you might sit and think, I don't have an addiction because I've got debt. But what they do is they challenge your view on that, and then you start to realise that actually there is no such thing as somebody who is weak-willed or somebody who has got addictive personality. They are somebody who is being marketed to and brainwashed in a way that their behaviours are essentially a product of what they're consuming, and that can be, like I say, advertising. I want to give you an example. I remember from the book regarding smoking, and they do use the same analogies in the one for debt, is that when you smoke, for example, the first time you have a cigarette, let's say everybody who doesn't smoke feels a score out of 100, they feel 100. So they're at a normal level, they feel good. When they then smoke, they might feel this kind of bit wonky, immediate sort of pickup or whatever it might be. But after smoking, their score drops to a 95. But the initial buzz they got from taking that drug, that nicotine drug, therefore made them feel kind of good. So what happens? They then, if they were to be honest, if they rated themselves out of 100, they've dropped down a bit. And then what they do is they try and therefore smoke another cigarette in an attempt to get, effectively, feel that real buzz again. But what they're really doing is trying to get back to 100. But then after they smoke that cigarette, they then start, as they smoke more and more, then if they gave themselves a score out of 100, they'd be down to about 90. And so they smoke a cigarette again to make them feel better, but it only gets them up to 95. But then after the come down, they go down to about 85, and then they smoke another cigarette and they get up to about 90. Effectively, what you're doing is the same as somebody who would wear a really tight pair of shoes just to get the relief, that moment when they take their shoes off. So when you have an addiction like smoking, it really only makes you feel worse. You get back to a level that's not even the same as somebody who isn't a smoker. So you are under this illusion. And in debt, it works in the same way. By overspending, they talk about it gives you this brief moment of feeling like somebody who doesn't have any debt. So it's an illusion of pleasure. So the reality is you're using debt to get the feeling of somebody who doesn't have debt, what it would be like. And it's just an illusion because you're accruing more and more. You're going to keep buying things to give you that feeling. I'll make myself feel better. I'm going to go and buy something in the shops, whatever that may be, that retail therapy. But you're getting further away from that feeling of normality. Somebody who doesn't have debt, like the smoker, the more they smoke, the worse they feel. They feel like they're getting better, but they're in a cycle.
And what's really clever about the book is by the end of the book, if you've read it correctly and you've understand the techniques, is it helps to teach you to change that feeling of pleasure. That feeling of pleasure comes from not spending. So using smoking as an example, when you get those what are called cravings or pangs that you get, he calls them pangs all the way through the book, and you get that little monster inside that's desperate for a cigarette, and then you cure it by having a cigarette, what you're able to do in the smoking book is cure that feeling of emptiness and like itchy craving. You cure that by reminding yourself that you're not a smoker and that you don't need it. And it's a really clever bit of psychology that you are able to actually cure yourself purely by understanding that you no longer need what you thought was the problem. Do you understand that?
I
It's
mean,
very
I
clever.
totally understand, because obviously it cured me of smoking, but it is that psychology. Because even now, going back all those years when I read the book 20 years ago, I can still remember the idea of like, yeah, but when I smoke that cigarette, I'm actually going back down to like a 95 and eventually going lower and lower. I'm only getting back to a level that's much lower than somebody who doesn't smoke. The analogy of walking around wearing overly tight shoes all day long just to get the feeling of that sort of illogical concept is effectively what you do when you smoke.
And using the debt idea, then, where you can hopefully read the book and then understand that your behaviors are perhaps the problem, whereas normally you would then spend to make yourself feel better. Once you understand that that isn't truly the case, hopefully you'll get the feeling of pleasure by cutting that off, understanding that that was what the problem was, and then actually getting pleasure from looking at your bank account and thinking, well, there's 10 or 15 pounds sitting in my bank that I wouldn't have had previously because I would have spent it. So you get the pleasure from the saving rather than the spending element.
Exactly. And it's not just about, the book doesn't berate you. It does shine a light. There'll be things about it that you might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but if you go with an open mind, the concept is quite interesting. For some people who aren't able just to go kind of cold turkey when it comes to debt, this might be something that might be helpful for them. And so what it does, it also starts to help you understand that aha moment. Yes, this is how the world works. This is how retail works. This is how marketing messages work. A good example, I've always talked on the podcast about, I think credit cards should be rebranded as debt cards. And funnily enough, he actually uses that same phrase in the book. And the idea that a credit card doesn't give you control. There's an idea that you've been sold that credit cards give you the ability to take control in the world because they give you the ability to buy things. There's always a positive connotation. But what you're really doing, as soon as you have a credit card, you're giving over all control you have of your finances to a debt company. So a credit card company, they dictate how much you can spend. You have a credit card limit, for example. They dictate where your income goes because things cost more if you buy them on debt, because don't forget they add interest. So it starts dictating how much you pay for things, and it therefore dictates what you can afford and what you can't afford. So the idea is that it starts to make you look at the world of debt very differently. And I think people who've come through that journey of having lots of debt and clearing it, they end up there. They start to realise the traps that are there for people. They don't give you debt because they like you. They give you debt because they want you to get into one of those spirals. It's like when you see these nature programs when there's a plant that's laid a trap effectively for a fly to go into, and the next minute the fly's got stuck and has ended up basically being falling into side the nectar or whatever it is in a plant. They use the analogy in the book actually, and it ends up effectively getting eaten alive by the plant and dissolved. And that idea is the sort of Venus flytrap. We see it throughout finance. So it starts to help you look at that problem and understand it. So in the end, the book does come up with practical steps, but the thing is, we provide lots of practical steps. You can see lots of practical steps of how you clear debt. What this is interesting is because it helps you understand the psychology of what's going on and how you can therefore overcome it. But one thing I just want to point out, I know a lot of people like the idea when I've talked in the past about spending plans rather than budget. So if you look at the idea that a budget can have connotations being quite negative, so you're depriving yourself of something, the book starts to reframe a lot of things. You realise that actually by clearing debt, you're not depriving yourself of anything. You're actually now giving yourself control, and you're actually, it's a positive thing. You're making positive choices. And what it means, you can start to spend money on the things that make you happy. It's very much about, the book starts moving into the direction about happiness. What does it mean? It's not about the things you own. It's about the things that you often do, the things you like, you enjoy. It starts making things positive. It gives a very, very good example of how a day a guy has where he goes to meet a friend, he starts becoming stressed about the amount of money it's costing to go for this meal, and when he goes there and other people are ordering rounds of drinks, and he basically ends up a miserable day, ruins his friend's birthday. Fundamentally, it comes down to the idea of his view of money and the debt that he had. Had he viewed the same day in a different way, it was much more positive. It's about, I'll get to see my friends, and he's already been in control in terms of I've got money to spend on this event, that kind of thing. Seeing the same day in two different ways, he looks at it saying that if you gain control of your debt, what you're really doing is allowing you to spend money on the things you want to do and not feeling bad or worried about doing that because of the debt pile that you've got. That's partly a result of the brainwashing you've received from marketing, the tricks from the credit card company. So overall, we've talked a lot about the book, and you might sit there and think, God, this is almost like an advertorial for it. It's a different process, but it was a book and a process that did have a material impact on me for giving up smoking. Same thing for Andy.
I'll happily say as well at this point, Damien, I used it to give up drink as well. I was a heavy drinker. I used to drink in the bars of London. I used to work in the city, and I made a decision that with a young daughter and a full life ahead of me, I should perhaps tackle that. And I did it through the book. I wouldn't have considered myself an alcoholic, but I was a habitual drinker. And I just used the steps in the book. And since I read that book, I've not touched a drop of alcohol. So it is actually a life-changing book for me personally. So I don't mind saying it's not an advertorial, but I don't mind giving it some time on the podcast.
Yeah, and so if we're going to put a link to it in the show notes. And one of the key things about the book, it's about talking about money, and it's about talking about things more openly, because then you understand you are not alone. This isn't a safety in numbers exercise. By sharing, you start to realise what is really happening out there, the brainwashing that's going on, and the things that you can do to counter that. And the thing that talking about money also does, and the book alludes to it, is that you realise these problems are universal. So just because people are rich, or a lot richer than you, doesn't mean they haven't got debt problems. Their debt problems are just probably a lot bigger, because there are a lot of people who live beyond their means and they've got lots of money, and yet they have huge amounts of debt, and then sometimes it can all come crashing down. So it starts to make you realise that situation. And the real thing is, it makes you think about taking positive action, and that process of reading something that's going to start to help you move in the right direction. And it's like the old proverb of every journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So if you found this useful and you do end up perhaps using this book, or you have other ideas or ways that you've managed to conquer debt, then please do share them. So there was a fantastic question in the Money to Masses Facebook community this week, and I'm going to jump on and add my own comment to this one. Somebody asked, what piece of financial advice would you give your 27-year-old self? Which I think is a brilliant question. And I think now some of us are older and wiser. I think there are definitely a few things I would have told myself back then. And that would have included topics such as debt. So it'd be great if more of you could jump onto that and leave your comments. And maybe we will do it as a piece on the podcast, because I think it's a fantastic discussion.